Welcome to AP Calculus AB. Today our focus is on the extreme value theorem. Before we get into that, let's do a little bit of a review. Definitions of relative and absolute extrema of a function. Extrema are absolute minimums and maximums, relative minimums and maximums. Relative extrema are points on the graph of a function that changes the function from increasing to decreasing or vice versa, also known as local extrema. Absolute extrema are the highest and lowest points on the graph of the function. Nothing's higher, nothing's lower. Let's look at a graph and some examples here. Identify the coordinates of the relative extrema. We define relative extrema points on the graph where the graph changes from decreasing to increasing or increasing to decreasing. So for example, the graph is decreasing here, and it is increasing where these blue sections are. So the relative extrema, we would have one at -3, 0, at -1, 0, and at 2, -6. So we have relative minimum at -3, 0, and +2, -6. We have relative maximums at -1, 0. I'm sorry, that's -1, 3. Clearly, we went up. It's not a 0. Don't know what happened on that. On the domain of f, what are the coordinates, the absolute extreme values? Absolute extreme values would be the highest and lowest points on the graph. As far as an absolute max goes, there is not one. The graph is going up forever. Absolute minimum would be here at 2, -6. Because that's the lowest point on the graph. It said, what are the coordinates? That's the coordinates. In general, if it says where is a point, that's referring to an x value. If it says what is the value, that's referring to a y value. On the interval, and this is interesting, on the interval from -2 to 3, what are the absolute extrema of function f? So I'm going to go, here is -2. And then here is 3. I am ignoring everything on the outside, and I am only concerned with what's happening inside of here. So the absolute extreme values, what's the lowest point on the graph? Well, it's still the absolute minimum is going to be 2, -6. The absolute maximum, well, it looks like the highest point now is -1, 3. So by changing the domain, we actually had an absolute maximum. If we had the domain as being all real numbers, there was not a highest point on the graph. Different question. On the interval from -4 to 1, be from here to here, what are the absolute extreme values? Well, we got to find the absolute maximum and absolute minimum. Highest point is going to be here, which looks like it's -4, 4. And the lowest point on the graph would be here, which looks like to be 1, -4. Your graph might be a little bit different because I changed these notes just a little bit. But mine clearly looks like 1 is happening here at -4. It's debatable, maybe it's not quite -4. So there's one example. Let's check out another example. Identify the coordinates of the relative extrema of G. Relative extrema is where the graph changes from decreasing to increasing. That's our definition of relative extrema, and that's happening in 2 places, right here and right here. So we have a relative maximum at -1, 4, and we have a relative minimum, 2 different places. So we got here, here, and here. I think I only circled 2 of those 3 a moment ago. At -3, -4, and this other one looks to be at 3, +2. On the domain of G, which is everything here in the graph, what are the coordinates of the absolute extrema? Well, the absolute max is going to be the point that's the highest on the graph. That looks to be here, which is 6, 5. The absolute minimum is the lowest point on the graph, which looks to be here, -3, -4. All right, now let's change the domain a little bit. Let's restrict the domain to go from -4 to 5. So that would be from here to here. It's the highest and lowest point on the graph. Well, it looks like the lowest point is still -3, -4. It's the absolute min. Absolute maximum, looks like we might have 2 of those. It looks like both 5 and -1 have the same y value of 4. So we have a tie for the absolute maximum. It's happening at -1, 4, and also at 5, 4. On the interval from -2 to 6, so it would be from here to here, what's the highest and lowest points on the graph from -2 to 6? Well, the lowest point appears to be here at -2. So it would be -2, 0. That would be the absolute minimum. Absolute maximum looks like to be up here at 6, which would be 6, 5. So this was a review of absolute minimums and maximums, relative minimums and maximums. And one thing that you want to take away from this before we get into the extreme value theorem is that the absolute extrema could happen at relative extreme values, or they could happen at the endpoints of the domain. So that concludes the introduction, which is a review of relative and absolute extrema. In the next video, we will get into the extreme value theorem.